Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
So I learned this week that I need to stop writing sermons on Monday. If y'all remember the last time I was here, how many sermons were there before Fridays? There were 3 sermons altogether last time. This week there were only 2. But that's a lot of sermons. In the high holiday season, there's other sermons to write this time of year. I had another sermon. Again, we'll do it another time, but I want to talk about, in a way, what's happening thousands of miles away. I want to talk about what's happening as the northern border of Israel is heating up in just a few minutes. And I'm not here to talk politics. Very much no. I have no policy advice. I'm a rabbi. I have no military strategy. I'm a rabbi. But I do want to talk about what happens to you and what happens to us when things become untenable. When things become untenable. So this week's Torah portion, we bring back to mind an untenable time in our people's story. That time when we were enslaved in Egypt. We have a paragraph in Parashat Kitavo that essentially captures the book of Exodus in a nutshell. We have in Deuteronomy 26, verse 6, and then I'm going to share verse 7. But in 26, verse 6, we have a verse in our Parsha that the Egyptians dealt harshly with us, they oppressed us, they imposed heavy labor upon us. That's verse 6. The Egyptians oppressed us, dealt harshly with us, oppressed us, imposed heavy labor upon us. And then there's that space, and then verse 7. Verse 7, which teaches, we cried out to God, and God freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. We cried out to God, God freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. So let's just do a little bit of review. Verse 6, the Egyptians dealt harshly with us, oppressed us, imposed heavy labor upon us. Verse 7, God freed us with a mighty hand. You were paying attention. Those are our 2 verses. But there's a lot that happens in the middle. What happens in the middle between Deuteronomy 26, verse 6, space, Deuteronomy 26, verse 7? You know what happens in that space? 400 years of Jewish history. 400 years of Jewish history. That is more history than we have known as Americans, than our country has known. That's a lot of time. And for those of you who have read the book of Exodus or just celebrated Passover, what's happened in those 400 years? The Egyptians enslaved us. They brutalized us. Fast forward, they threw baby boys into the Nile. Fast forward, Moses was rescued. Fast forward, Moses was raised as a prince in Egypt. Fast forward, Moses flees into the wilderness. Fast forward, and then God frees us. We cried out to God, and God freed us with a mighty hand. So here's the question. How many years was that in that space between verses 6 and 7? 400 years. So why did it take so long for us to cry out? Why did it take us 400 years before we cried out? And let me ask you, because it can take a long time before you cry out. I just want you to get into the minds of the Israelites for a moment. Why did it take so long to cry out? When you cry out, that's when things can go from bad to worse. That's when the people who hurt you have the opportunity to hurt you more when you cry out. When you cry out, especially before there's a solution in place, you are putting yourself out there and expressing a problem that very well could get worse before it gets better. It took the Israelites 400 years to cry out. It took the Israelites 400 years. So let me ask you, how many days, how many weeks, how many months, how many decades will it take for you to cry out? For us to cry out when something becomes absolutely untenable? What does it take for you, for us, to cry out? And so I do want to talk about what's going on Israel's northern border. And I'm going to give just a bit of a primer in case you didn't study Middle Eastern politics or go to rabbinical or cantorial school or have blessedly stayed away from the news over the past week. Israel has a northern border with Lebanon. Lebanon is by and large run by a terrorist organization called Hezbollah. And I'm not being political here. Hezbollah's most injured victims are the citizens of its own country in Lebanon. Hezbollah is a terrorist extension of the Iranian regime. I heard a cruelly horrible joke just a few days ago that Iran will fight Israel until the very last Lebanese. And very sadly, that's how Hezbollah is functioning in this country. They've taken over Lebanon's government, they've destroyed its economy, and they are dragging this poor country ever closer to a full-blown war. There was, in fact, a war in Israel, between Israel and Lebanon, between Israel and Hezbollah. In 2006, when my wife and I were there, we were 22 years old. It was our first year in Jerusalem, and it was also the first time I've ever had rockets that could reach me. And it was absolutely terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. Now, the war ended, thank God, and the conditions of the war were such that Hezbollah would not reoccupy southern Lebanon, that Hezbollah would not rearm, and now we are seeing a terrorist organization on the southern border of this country, tragically, terrorize its own citizens. They ended that war with 15,000 rockets, and despite promises not to rearm, they are now equipped with about 150,000. And I can promise you, everybody knows where they're pointed. So that's where we are right now. Since October 7th, Hezbollah has fired over 6,000 rockets into Israel. There are close to 100,000 Israelis who have had to leave their homes. And that is all my way of saying that this problem has become untenable. And I want to just say again, I'm not a politician. I'm not a military expert. I'm a rabbi. And so I don't have any political commentary here. I don't have any military commentary here. But I do have a question, which is, what do you do when things become untenable? What do you do when things become untenable? I also want to say very clearly, the last thing I or anybody here wants is a full-scale war. Oh my God. I've been fearing a full-scale war with Hezbollah since 2006. It would be absolutely devastating. But what do you do? And what do we do when something becomes absolutely untenable? And that's really the question, if I can shift with you all for a minute, of our High Holy Day season. What do we do when something becomes untenable? Because the thing about the problems that we face, especially for days and weeks and months and decades, is that they rarely solve themselves. Isn't that right? The problems that we've been facing for days and weeks and months and decades, they almost never solve themselves. Now, when we sit here, or in our chapel most likely, on Yom Kippur, there are a few different kinds of teshuvah that we do. There are two different kinds of questions that we ask. There are two different kinds of problems that we solve. They're the problems that we're facing internally. And these are difficult. Problems of jealousy, problems of anger, problems of resentment, those corrosive things that eat us up inside. We sit in our sanctuary, and maybe during an inspired piece of liturgy or some beautiful music by our Cantor, we think about those fights that we're fighting inside. And those are hard, don't get me wrong. But they pale in comparison to the struggles that we have with other people. If you are like me, most of the time we will stop at those internal struggles if we even ever get there. And those struggles that we have, those long simmering challenges that you might have with the people you love, maybe they wait until next year. Right? The problem with problems is that they rarely solve themselves. But the resentment and the hurt and the anger that fuels so much of what brings people to Yom Kippur and to the season of Teshuvah, it doesn't go away just because time passes. It does not pass just because time does. And so my question that I want to ask you tonight before I wrap up is the question that bridges Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 6, and Deuteronomy 26, verse 27, which is, what will it take for you to cry out? What will it take for you to cry out? And I want to share that Yom Kippur is that day, that we cry out. Yom Kippur in the season of Teshuvah is that time where we make what is inside known. It's not an easy day. For those of you who observe Yom Kippur is a day where we don't eat, we don't drink, we don't do anything life-affirming physically and spiritually. It's the hardest day there is. And then I came across this teaching from our rabbis that continues to move me, and I want to share this with you. That Yom Kippur is the most joyful day of the Jewish calendar. Isn't that wild? Yom Kippur, our tradition teaches, is the most joyful day of our year. You know why? Because Yom Kippur is the day that we cry out. Yom Kippur is the day that we make what is inside outside. Yom Kippur is the day that we imagine for a moment. It's the moment that we imagine what drives that pain and hurt and resentment finally being solved. It's the day that we imagine the distance between us and the people we love or used to love being bridged. It's the day that we imagine closeness once again. It is the day that we cry out so that healing can begin again. Yom Kippur is the day that we cry out. The Jewish season, the Jewish calendar revolves around us making what is inside known again. And so God has freed us before. God freed us from Egypt the moment we cried out. And God can free us again. Whenever you are ready to cry out, that is the moment that your journey towards freedom begins. And so let's cry out tonight. Let's cry out in this season. And please, God, come next year. We will know wholeness, healing, and peace. Amen. Shabbat shalom.
Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Page 256. Return again, sort of. Return again, return to the land of your soul. Return to what you are, return to who you are, return to where you are, born and reborn again. Return again, return again, return to the land